What's up, guys? So I got asked a question recently about Russian fighters and why there's so many really good fighters from Russia. And I think the answer is multiple things, but one of the reasons, the main reason why is because they start so young. Their national sport is Sambo. You have sport Sambo and you have combat Sambo. From what I know, sport Sambo is just wrestling, judo throws, and submissions with joint manipulation. In sport Sambo, you can't do, or in Sambo, you can't do rear naked chokes, guillotines, no neck attacks. It's only joint manipulation, wrist locks, arm bars, leg locks. And on top of that, judo and wrestling. So that's one thing. They're doing these martial arts from such a young age, and they really do apply to the sport. Whether you're doing sport Sambo like that or you're doing combat Sambo where they allow kickboxing as well, that's even worse. So some of these guys that come into the UFC that you see, they have hundreds of Sambo matches. So if you have especially if you're talking about combat Sambo where you're throwing hands and kicks as well, along with the grappling. If someone comes into MMA and they have 200 Sambo fights, they basically have 200 fights because Sambo is very close to MMA. You know, you're not allowed to guillotine. You're not allowed to do certain moves, and rear naked chokes, neck attacks, certain moves that are allowed in MMA. But for the most part, a lot of it is allowed in MMA. A lot of boxing, kickboxing, wrestling, judo, and joint manipulations do happen. So they have a way earlier start than the average fighter. And also it seems like their technique, first of all, the majority of the high level Russians, their technique is phenomenal. But honestly, the majority of all Russian fighters that I've saw, there's a few that have a little rough technique, especially striking. They're wild, they're not technical, but as a whole they all have good technique. And I don't know. I think I'm assuming because there's so many gyms over in Russia, you don't really have as many McDojos because people don't stay at those gyms. Like in America, there's a lot of karate, there's a lot of taekwondo, there's a lot of even jiu-jitsu gyms, if you're talking about from the perspective of producing a high-level fighter, that are basically McDojos, that they're only going to get you to a certain level. Like the average jiu-jitsu gym you walk into, you're not going to become a black belt, brown belt world champion at these levels, at that level, being at that gym. You're not going to probably get in the UFC at the average gym. There is exceptions if you're an exceptional athlete and a fighter, and that matters. Being exceptional matters and everything. But I'm talking about as a group, the Russians, they all have good technique. It's almost like there's hardly any McDojos over there, which I know that's not the case, but I'm thinking that most people, the good fighters, just don't stay there. They end up leaving those gyms and going to the gym, up the street or whatever, because I'm assuming they have a lot of gyms, as many fighters as they produce, and how serious they take this sport. So yeah, that's a pretty simple answer, but they start so young. They're so technical in everything, striking, grappling, wrestling, submissions, boxing, like everything. And they're just a serious combat country, and they believe in it, and they started it from a young age. And it's really hard for guys to compete with that, especially from a grappling standpoint, if you haven't been doing it most of your life. This is why I need to make a video about this actually, but this is why if you start later in life, I think you almost always have to be a striker, unless you're like you have some freak attributes. If you're a freak athlete, you can kind of be anything. You can be a striker, grappler, or whatever you want to be, counter puncher, pressure fighter, if you're a freak athlete. But if you're not, these guys that have been doing Sambo, and especially like the sport Sambo, the wrestling and the submissions more, their whole life, and they've been grappling their whole life at this high level, it's almost impossible to beat these guys if you start even as a high school wrestler in America. So it's not impossible, but it seems like it, because these Russians hardly ever lose on the ground. But you really need to kind of be a striker if you start fighting at an older age. So I'm going to make a video about that as well. But as far as the Russians go, they're phenomenal. Their technique is good in everything. Their wrestling, their judo, their jiu-jitsu, I mean, everything is good. They're boxing. They're very technical. They keep their hands up. They turn their punches over. They have a good in and out boxing and striking style. They tend to have decent Muay Thai. When I was in I've been to Thailand 5 times training Muay Thai, and every time at every camp I went to, there was Russians training. I went to Phuket Top Team. I went to Tiger. I went to Penchandi. I went to Fairtex, Max Muay Thai. All of these gyms had Russian fighters training at the times I was over there. So Russia's pretty close to decently close flight to Thailand, and it's very cheap in Thailand. So I'm assuming that's why they go there, and the training is great. So they have everything. I mean, these guys are, I just feel like they take combat sports more serious than the majority of other countries, and it works for them. You know, they have champions, and they have a lot of good fighters that I would say they have a lot of good fighters that are not in the UFC, that probably are never going to be in the UFC, that could beat a lot of the UFC roster for sure. So yeah, I just think their technique is so good. They have they started at a young age, and it's, when you start at a young age, it's thousands of reps, you know, added up, you know, makes a great fighter. You know, you fast forward, do the same, you know, 20, 30, 40 moves you learn over the course of 5 or 10 years, and you just keep drilling these moves and doing these techniques and having all these competition matches, Sambo, sports Sambo, combat Sambo, judo tournaments. They do so much combat sports that it's just ingrained in them so well that it just makes it for really technical, amazing fighters. So that is my assessment of Russian fighters. They're phenomenal, and you can learn a lot by watching these guys for sure. If you're new to martial arts and you're looking for a gym in your area, get my book, The Ultimate Guide to Choosing Your Martial Arts School and Instructor. And if you have any questions or any other subjects you'd like me to talk about, leave a comment below. Thank you, guys.